friends and welcome back. My name is Katey and today we are doing just a bit of a fun video that I stole from the beauty community. Recently, a lot of the beauty YouTube channels that I watch have been sharing the 10 eyeshadow palettes they would keep if they could only keep 10. And that got me thinking about the 10 decks, both Tarot and Oracle together. The 10 decks I would keep if I only had space or was only allowed to have 10. Now, of course, this is hypothetical, and if I did this in another 6 months' time, I feel like my answer would be very different. That is in part because I recently just got a whole bunch of new decks, which I did do a deck haul of, and I will leave a link to in the cards above for you if you want to check that out. And I didn't want to include any decks that are new to me, that I haven't really spent a lot of time with. I just wanted to share the decks that have really stood the test of time for me. But I do also feel like I'm on a bit of a precipice. I feel like I'm on the edge of quite a big change in my tarot practice, or I'm in the midst of it, I suppose. And so I feel like a lot of the decks that I've chosen are decks that I would have chosen for the last few years. Like if I'd done this at any other point in the last 3 or 4 years, this stack of 10 would look pretty similar. Whereas I'm starting to feel like maybe in a year's time, in 2 years' time, the stack might look quite different. And so I thought it would be nice to reflect on the 10 decks that, at least for now, really feel like they're central to me in my practice and that I can't do without. And I think it'll be interesting to see in a year or two if I really have changed as much as I feel like I am changing at the moment. There are definitely a few decks from my deck haul that I'm very tempted to include. For example, the Chrysalis Tarot is blowing my mind. The Orion's Tarot, I've never enjoyed an animal deck so much, but I want to keep it simple. I want to focus on the 10 decks that I don't know how I could ever let them go, at least at this point in my life. And again, this is both Tarot and Oracle, so only 10 decks and that's it. Okay, let's get the most obvious out of the way. It's the Rider-Waite-Smith. I needed to have one copy of it, and this, the purple box, is my favorite. Now, to be honest, I do not use the Rider-Waite-Smith a whole lot these days for readings, but I do still use it for reference. When I'm reading about cards, when I'm doing exercises, for example, from the Tarot for Transformation, when I'm reviewing decks, I don't know, I just find it's very helpful to have a Rider-Waite-Smith on hand. And this UK purple box edition from the 90s is my favorite edition. Don't get me wrong, the Blushing Fool blue boxes and all of those, they're beautiful. I do also have the Centennial and I really enjoy that edition too. This for me is just the perfect happy medium. It's not like some incredibly expensive vintage collector item, but the colors are a little more muted, the cardstock's a little nicer than some of the modern yellow boxes. And so this is absolutely my Rider-Waite-Smith of choice, and it is a deck that I would have to keep if I could only keep 10. Okay, now let's get the second most obvious one out of the way. The Gill Tarot. Of course Katey picks the Gill Tarot. Again, I have to be honest, this is not a deck that I use all the time. I know I'm sort of known on TarotTube at this point for the Gill Tarot being my soul deck, which is a term that I've done a whole video on several years ago. I will leave a link to that in the cards above for you and in the description box. And at the end of the day, I don't use this deck all the time, but it still feels really special to me. And it feels like the sort of deck that, I don't know, it's just a little piece of me that is a part of me, and I don't know how I would have a tarot collection without the Gill Tarot. I love this old edition. I love that it came to me in such a synchronistic, easy way. And that's the other thing about soul decks is I hear people going out on this hunt, but at least for me, part of what makes this deck feel so special is the way in which it found me. It was effortless, it was unexpected, it was synchronistic. Anyway, this deck is one that I've just connected with in a way that I've connected with very few other decks. I've never read for anybody else with this deck, and I don't think that I ever could. It feels so close to me and personal that I don't want to share it. It's a weird looking deck. I get that it's not for everybody. The minor arcana in particular are quite unusual in the way that Elizabeth Josephine Gill has chosen to represent them. They have big keywords all over them. They're not very scenic, but something about this deck just clicks with me, just works for me, and it still remains one of those decks that is just really close to my heart. And even though it's not one I pull out to use all the time, it is one that is always there for me when I'm sort of like in a dark night of the soul or just really struggling, or I just need something, I don't know, just a little bit special to help me through. That is what this deck is for me, and I adore it. Now, another deck that has been with me for a long time is the Fantastic Menagerie. I love this deck. It just makes me laugh. It's a clever deck with a very dark sense of humor, and that's something I really appreciate about the deck. I think this has my favorite Hierophant card of all time. It's so twisted, it's funny in a sick kind of way. It feels satirical, it feels like a commentary on humanity, and it just, for me, it provides such a great mirror that I just can't help but laugh at myself, you know? And I think the way that tarot can disarm us in that way, And for me, the Fantastic Menagerie does that better than almost any other deck I've ever worked with. And I think it allows me to sort of dig into areas that maybe I would normally be a little sensitive or defensive around. I don't know, it's just such a fabulous deck. I love it. It's one that really helped me kind of become the reader that I am in a lot of ways. It's my only Bubba Studios deck. I mean, I appreciate the artistry of Bubba Studios, but they're not really a publisher that I like a lot from. Something about this deck just clicks with me and works for me though. And it's another one that has been such a big part of my practice and my experience of tarot for a long time now. I feel like I'm just doing all the most obvious decks to start with. And these two, they go together. They're by the same artist. If you know me, you know what two decks are coming. It's the Dreamtime reading cards and the Saltwater reading cards by Laura Bowen. These are absolutely my favorite Oracle decks of all time. Like there's no competition. That never has been. The Dreamtime reading cards is one of the first decks I ever shared on this channel. It's been my favorite ever since then. The Saltwater reading cards is the only deck that's ever come close for me as far as Oracle decks are concerned. I love that they both are so distinctively Laura Bowen in terms of her writing and the way that she puts the guidebooks together, her art, everything. But then each has its own personality, its own feeling. The Dreamtime reading cards feels quite well-rounded. It has a very earthy, fiery feeling to it, but at the same time it feels quite holistic. The Saltwater reading cards is obviously very watery, but I love that we've focused in on saltwater specifically. I feel like a lot of the time when we talk about water, the energy of water, we're talking more about the feeling and the energy of fresh water, of healing, of gentle, of calming, of compassion, of connection, all of that sort of stuff. Salt water though is all of those things, but harsh. It's intense, it's invigorating, it's refreshing. It is healing, but not in the soft, gentle way. Salt water in a wound hurts. And I just feel like this is vibrant and alive in a way that a lot of other water-themed decks don't come alive in the same way for me. Obviously, I also just love that so many of the animals and the landscape features and the flora that are included in these decks are things that I'm familiar with as an Australian. I think for the longest time, the Dreamtime reading cards was my favorite Oracle deck. In the last couple of years though, I have been using the Saltwater reading cards more and more, and I think it may have edged out in front. But I adore both. These are both my two favorite Oracle decks by far. Now the sixth deck is another tarot deck, and it is the Stella's Tarot. Another deck I've had for so long. My version is trimmed, it's very much modified, and I have written on the cards. So it's become this adorable little pocket deck. This is one of those decks that I can pull out and just read with. Like there's no hesitation, there's no pause, there's no confusion. I just flow really easily with this deck. I really like the artwork. I love the colors. I love how vibrant it is. I love that the artwork sort of feels almost collagey, but at the same time, like it's fine art. I love that the moon is a motif that is recurring throughout the deck. This is another one with a bit of a weird sense of humor, but it's not quite as dark and messed up as the Fantastic Menagerie feels. But I do find that the readings I do with it do sort of encourage me not to take myself too seriously, and I do find myself giggling or laughing at myself when I'm doing readings with this deck. I love the people and how they're depicted. I love how expressive their body language is, I guess. And it feels a little bit creepy, but then also a little bit like a weird carnival world. There's just something very, very charming about it that I love, and that pulls me in every single time I work with it. The next deck is a much more recent deck, and it is the Next World Tarot, which is huge. This deck is so big. I love this deck. I have had some of the most profound and moving readings with these cards. I love how detailed the artwork is. I love how you have such a strong character or characters in the foreground, but then the background in each and every card is so detailed and almost becomes a character in and of itself as well. Even though these cards are borderline too big for me to handle, I appreciate the larger perspective of the card, because I do feel like there's so much going on that, at least for me and my eyesight, I worry that I would miss bits of the artwork, or it would become messy for me if it were a lot smaller. I love that this deck offers us a different perspective on our lived reality, on the world that we experience today. I love that it features so prominently and celebrates different people and identities that we don't see enough of in tarot. And even though this deck is sort of like a near future dystopia, it still feels so much more realistic than 90% of the other decks that I've looked at, because the people in it are real. I see myself in this deck in ways that I have not seen myself represented in other cards. I see my community represented in ways that I don't normally see represented. And that gives me a fuller, more holistic, more exciting, more compelling experience with each and every card, and with tarot as a system. Ultimately, this deck both excites invites and moves me. I find it so beautiful, so touching, so celebratory. It's realistic and it's hopeful, and there's something so special about that. I think this was one of the first decks that made me really appreciate the hyper contemporary decks, the decks that don't look like old timey or like they could fit any time and place. I love this deck. I think it's so special, and I'm just so glad that we have it. And some of the readings I've done with this deck, I cannot even begin to express how much they've helped me. Okay, next up I had to include another Oracle deck, and I chose the Life Design cards by Lisa McLaughlin. Now, Lisa McLaughlin, I think, has or is redesigning this deck and kind of reissuing a new edition. I do love Lisa's artwork, so I'm curious about that one, but there's just something so special about the connection that I have with this deck that no part of me feels like I need a different version of it. Even though I'm not always incorporating Oracle into my practice, there are some times in my life where I need Oracle and not Tarot. And so I just knew I needed to include something special like this one. This is such a unique Oracle deck. It is based on the principles of permaculture, something I don't know a whole lot about, but I don't think you need to in order to enjoy and use this deck. The guidebook is great and super helpful, but I just love the artwork. Lisa's artwork is so beautiful, and what I especially love about this deck is how unique the keywords or the titles are. These are cards that you will not see in every Oracle deck. And this deck, at least in my experience, has this way of being like weirdly accurate to the point it's uncanny. It has a very earthy feel, which of course goes along with the theme of permaculture, but that is also something that I just appreciate in terms of my experience of the deck, of that groundedness. This is one of my all-time favorite Oracle decks, and aside from Laura Bowen's decks, this is my other go-to Oracle deck that I don't know that I could ever let go of. I adore it. It's been with me for a long time now. I managed to score it secondhand, and I could not be more happy with the experiences I've had with this deck. It's just an all-round good time, and absolutely a deck I would need to keep with me if I could only keep 10. Next up is the newest deck to me out of all of these. It is the Spacious Tarot by Carrie and Annie. I recently did a Tarot in Practice Keep or Cull video featuring this deck, so if you'd like to sort of see me working with this deck over the course of a few weeks and see some of the readings and exercises I did with it, I will leave a link to that in the cards and in the description box below for you. And I love this deck. I love Annie's artwork. It's so beautiful, but it's soothing. It doesn't shout the meaning of the card at you. Instead, it invites you in. And some of these feature among my favorite depictions of certain cards, like the Emperor, for example. I just love it. I love the colors. I love the choices. I love Carrie's messages in the guidebook. I love the production. I just love everything about this deck. It feels so thoughtfully curated. It feels so subtle and clever. And like there is space for us. I've said it before, but it just feels like there's space for us as individuals in these cards. Like we're not being dictated the answers to, we're being invited to explore our own interactions with each individual card. Like there's enough, but not too much. And I just feel like that subtlety, that nuance requires a level of restraint of the creators. And I think they nailed it. It's one of my favorite decks to read with. It has quickly become one of my favorites. As I mentioned, this is by far the newest deck to me that has managed to make this list. And I adore it. I don't know how else to put it. I do. And then a deck that I resisted when it was first released, and then when I finally got a copy, I could not get over how much I loved it, is the Sasarai Beto Tarot by Stasha Barrington. I have done a very thorough review of this deck, which again, I will leave in the cards in the description box for you if you're interested. I love this artwork. I love the colors that are used. And ultimately, the thing that I always say about this deck is that it feels intimate. There's something about these cards that feel like a personal connection with the character in the card. Each person feels like they've been captured in a really intimate, vulnerable moment that you get to witness, get to share with them. And to me, there's something so touching and wholesome and moving about that experience. I guess it just feels like a very human, personal deck with a really big heart. Again, it's one of those decks that I just love the choices the artist has made in terms of how they've chosen to depict each meaning of the card. The representations just make sense to me. When I look at them, I'm like, yes, I get it. I understand you. I just connect with the language of the Sasarai Beto Tarot, and it is always a great experience for me reading with this deck. The messages I get from it always feel really compassionate and encouraging. And ultimately, when I read with this deck, it just hits me in the feels and I love it. So if I could only keep 10 decks, both Oracle and Tarot, those are the 10 that I would choose. At least if I had to make this decision today. Like I said, there are a few decks that are sort of edging up towards this list, and there were a few that it was very hard for me not to include, like the Idiosyncratic and the Chrysalis Tarot. Even the Orions and the Star Spinner and the Circo Tarot, and I was really surprised that I didn't include the Liminal Tarot. But anyway, it was a lot of fun sort of looking through my collection and really whittling it down. And normally when I've done these sort of exercises in the past, I've done like tarot and oracle separately, but I really wanted to just get it down to 10 decks. 10 decks, that's it. Anyway, I would love to hear in the comments below what your 10 decks would be. No caveats, no honorable mentions, just what are the 10 decks if you could only have 10 that you would keep. Obviously, I know there's plenty of you who don't even have 10 decks, so this question doesn't really apply to you. You've won by default, congratulations. But for those of us with a larger collection, I think it can be really fun to just sort of look through our collection from this perspective and just like consider what it is that we really, really value, what is central to that collection for us. And of course, over time things will change, but at least for now, I couldn't not pick these 10. So thank you so much to the beauty community for providing such great content ideas for me to steal. And of course, thank you to my patrons over on Patreon, and an especially big thank you goes to Livia, Lynette Brown, Laurie, and Ian Yitzhak for their above and beyond support. They tip me each month so that I can provide these videos to you each week for free. And thank you, of course, for watching. I would love to chat to you in the comments about the 10 decks that you would pick if you could only keep 10. Or if you want to make a video response, I'd also love to see that. Please leave a link to it in the comments below so that I can come and watch your video. But that is all from me for now. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, so much love. Bye.